Hold on a moment, Heavy Rain. You can't just walk across all willy-nilly like that. That's jaywalking. You need to come over here. You you need to cross over here. It's safer, trust me. So I need to clear something up before we get started. Heavy Rain is a Kuranta, yes, but she is not a horse. She is a zebra. Yes, all the other Kuranta are horses or horse-related, but Heavy Rain isn't. So stop asking me about that, please. Heavy Rain is an operator that quickly built a reputation for herself when she was released in Walk in the Dust, and it's no overstatement that Heavy Rain is certainly one of the most unique operators in the game, bringing the coveted camouflage mechanic to the table. And while the ability to throw a pile of leaves onto her friends has proven useful, I would caution against the mindset that Heavy Rain simply exists as a cheap John Cena cosplay. There is quite a bit more to this zebra than that. But before we get into why her talent is the most god-awful thing on this planet, we first need to understand not only what is Heavy Rain, but more importantly, how is Heavy Rain? I've heard she's doing well. Now I don't mean that Heavy Rain is a zebra. I mean to say that Heavy Rain is a protector defender, which really means absolutely nothing, because the kinds of niches that protector defenders occupy really makes you lose sight of what the subclass is trying to accomplish. Defenders really are Hypergryph's art project after they've had a few too many anniversary controversies. You have healers, taunters, damage, team buffers, res tanks, dev tanks, pushers, and of course with Heavy Rain, you have convincing disguises. However, protector defenders do have common traits that pull them together. For 5 stars and above, you can expect around 19 to 21 cost, around 3 to 4,000 HP, 3 to 400 attack, and varying amounts of defense and resistance. Of course, Heavy Rain is no exception, and like all defenders that aren't trying to 1v1 the sun and come out blind, they all block 3 enemies. When it comes to which defenders you should use, many players push protected defenders out of sight in favor of other subclasses that can bring more useful skills that aren't just being thick. And when protectors are used, the general consensus is just use these 3 and get it over with. But every so often, that video pops up in your recommended feed that's like, oh my god, Heavy Rain busted, camouflage OP, cheesing boss, 1000 IQ clear, ignore mechanic, who is Chalter? And you see this boss dying of cringe with Heavy Rain looking on as they never saw it coming. And I have no doubt that some of you saw this video and thought, hey, that's pretty good. Then decided to level your own Heavy Rain, realized she needs 9 Heavyrains concentrations, which made you cry from how far this will set back your 1-7 farming. You brought her to a stage, forgot the boss has 2 phases, all your operators judge you, and then you return to the swimsuit meta. So let's return to reality and get a closer look into how Heavy Rain works. Her first skill is... Wait, what? What's this? Oh, it's useless. It's useless. It's like you just never. Right, I mean, I should still talk about it, right? It's still part of the kit, yeah? Yeah, I'll talk about it? Okay. Do you understand why this skill is bad? Or at least why you should think real hard about yourself if you do consider using it? Let me use this analogy. I want you to imagine that it's your first day at school. You walk into your first class, and right off the bat, they slap you with a group work project, and you're forced to work with people that you really don't want to interact with. Fast forward a week, and nothing has been done. The project is due in 3 days. One of your group members says they'll do it tomorrow, so they're hopeless. One says they already did their part, so you check, and all they did is put word art on the document, and the last member actually did something, but you get this creeping feeling that you could have just done better if you did it yourself. What I'm saying is that emergency camouflage is oftentimes too little, too late. The greatest thing about camouflage is that it can cheese enemies really hard, and emergency camouflage gives you zero control over this greatest thing, because it's essentially random which ally Heavy Rain uses it on, especially when there are multiple allies around her all taking damage. It's inherently reactive in nature because it only activates below 50% HP, and the tiny amount of healing means that Heavy Rain will eventually restore the ally to just above 50% HP, which is the first ingredient for getting one shot. If emergency camouflage is activating, you probably already got hit by the big attack you needed to mitigate, and camouflage as a reactive measure is more like a band-aid rather than the game-changing ability it is that can turn the tide of battle. If you're considering emergency camouflage, the only emergency you'll have to worry about is what I'm about to do to you. As a Arknights player, I shudder at the thought of having to use this skill for the measly amount of healing that it provides. But I am nonetheless forced into doing so in very rare situations. So if you aren't doing something like me and sponsoring your own suffering, the use case for this skill goes from 1% of the time to basically never. I humbly request that you look elsewhere. And where else to look than the real reason why you even consider Heavy Rain in the first place? Next up, we have group camouflage, because everything is better with friends. As long as it's not group work. Now, I do want to take the time to explain camouflage as a mechanic for those of you that don't really understand. Much like stuns, silence, and other forms of crowd control, the power of camouflage is basically contingent on Hypergryph's arbitrary decision making. Is this ability going to be affected by X mechanic? No? Well, tough luck. The only important information you need to know about camouflage is that it does not protect you from splash damage. Or does it? Now, it might seem that the term splash damage is pretty easy to understand, but there are certain cases where an exception will make you think, what? For example, a bomb tail, when it releases the bomb, deals splash damage in an area, and lo and behold, Heavy Rain's camouflage does not work. A reunion caster clearly does splash damage, and same deal, it goes through. Now, take an ability like Viviana's Glimmering Touch, for example, the tactical nuke. It certainly seems like splash damage, but when you try it, it somehow doesn't go through and your operators take no damage. Okay, well, what about something else like the Gelato Stop from Guide Ahead? That's kinda like Glimmering Touch, right? So it should mitigate the damage, but you try it and you get hit anyways. Now, the astute amongst you might think that there is a difference between splash damage and something like area damage, and I too think that this is the case, where most of the confusing exceptions that I run into tend to be in this area damage category. If you were to give a reasonable definition to splash damage, you might agree that an attack that deals splash damage needs to target an operator, and the subsequent attack deals damage to surrounding friendly units. Reunion casters and bombtails certainly fall into this category under the definition. Area damage can similarly be defined as damage that is dealt with no regard to a particular target. So for example, the snack carts from Guide Ahead or the sea crawlers from Undertides can fall into the area damage category because they don't target an operator with the damage, they just deal damage around a point indiscriminately. But then we get into the puzzling case of artillery targeteers and Viviana. Trying this against the artillery drones, it doesn't work. And I think you can justify it to yourself that yes, it targeted an operator, then dealt damage around that point. Classic splash damage. But then we go to Viviana without checklist. She targets an operator. The ability is certainly doing damage around the targeted point, but when we try it, it somehow works. Maybe it has something to do with this area being well defined and not just a point with a circle around it. Well then, why does freeze, whiff, and warp go through? the area is well defined and it is a targeted attack, why doesn't Scandoin? His scan feels like an indiscriminate attack, but it is blocked nonetheless. Why doesn't Frost Nova's Frost Nova go through? It certainly looks like area damage, and even if you knew that it actually targets an operator, that's even more incriminating evidence that it should function like splash damage and go through anyways. Now before we start going too deep into this, basically the gist of what I'm trying to get at here is that Arknights is weird, and if you want to use Heavy Rain, the best way to figure out if it works is to try. If you really want to put Heavy Rain's camo into your strategies, just go and do it and see if it works. Go and test it, figure it out, hold off on immediately looking for a guide after you fail stage and bust out the secret technology that you swore would be useful one day. Now about group camouflage specifically, it only lasts 20 seconds and comes up every 40, which does seem like a long-ish time, but if you're using it to cheese an enemy ability, which you probably are, 20 seconds can sometimes feel a bit inadequate, but as most boss abilities have long cooldowns, usually your camo will be back up when you need it, and in many scenarios I found that I only ever need one use of this skill to beat a boss in the first place. The other really interesting thing about this skill is that it does give some defense, only 55% mind you, but it also boosts Heavy Rain's health by 55%, and HP is actually a pretty decent buff because it allows her to survive a few more instances of arts damage. Now why would you be using Heavy Rain to tank arts damage? Well, Heavy Rain being a central part of your strategy, you might have to deal with enemies that don't deal physical damage, and keep in mind that when group camouflage is active, you can still use Heavy Rain as a defender, blocking something while you camouflage your other units. The health certainly helps in those situations, particularly when there are multiple different types of damage incoming, and especially since you're probably tanking a boss enemy that does a lot of damage. Also, when you're trying to tank a particularly large physical damage attack, buffing both defense and health is sometimes better than just defense considering how damage is calculated in Arknights. Keep in mind that when a camouflaged unit is blocking an enemy, they are no longer considered camouflaged, so in some cases you can block with Heavy Rain to bait an attack while protecting your other operators with camouflage. In other news, Heavy Rain shouldn't really be used as a normal defender. Like I said earlier, there's a reason why there's only really 3 protected defenders that are ever used in the kind of tanking role, but Heavy Rain is definitely an operator that is good to keep in your back pocket if you're getting really frustrated with a particular enemy. It also feels really nice because you don't necessarily have to mastery her skills, because most abilities you'll want to cheese only last a couple of seconds at most, so feel free to save your resources on that one. If you're looking for an actual defender, Heavy Rain is not really your go-to. She's more of a niche pick, more like a specialist than a defender, which goes back into the whole protected defender niche thing, I know, but she's not a mainstay of your comp all the time. As for her talent, it makes me want to die. It's just physical damage dodge, don't think too much about it. Also, to end this off, a word about her future modules. The most important thing is that she gets 4 block instead of 3, and her talent is slightly improved, which you can take for what it is. But like I said earlier, you're probably not using Heavy Rain as a tank, so these buffs are questionable at best, and don't really change the way you would be using Heavy Rain with the camouflage, but hey, more stats is always cool. And that's it for Heavy Rain, guys. And just to be frank with you at the end here, I don't really have a high opinion of camouflage or invisibility, in the same way to how I don't really like silence as a mechanic, because I feel like ignoring an enemy ability is kind of the most boring way to deal with a problem. Similar to how in Chapter 9, we had to deal with refraction, and everyone just said, oh, you can silence it and you don't have to deal with it. Kind of takes away from the experience of doing the stages and finding the enemies, in my opinion. But I will admit that it is a satisfying feeling to body a boss after you've failed so many times and just say, you know, stick up the middle finger, I guess. Just a quick word of thanks for like nearly 500 subs or something. It's kind of surreal. But yeah, okay. Have a nice zebra. See you later.